Good evening. Hi, everybody, dear colleagues, dear friends. I am very happy to welcome all of you who join us today at the continuation of our public program series titled Armed Democracy. And today's event it will be dedicated to nuclear blackmail and fossil fascism. And I am first of all very thankful and happy that my colleagues and dear friends Svitlana Matviyenko and Oleksiy Radynski join us today. So thank you so much, dear friends, that you kindly agreed to take part in our series. My name is Vasil Cherepanin. I represent Visual Culture Research Center in the Kyiv Biennial. And again, traditionally, first of all, I would like to express our thankfulness, especially from those of us who are in Ukraine, to the Ukrainian military, which enabled this series, because without them, we wouldn't be able even to sit here. So this Armed Democracy series, which will run till tomorrow, actually, has been conceived by the Kyiv Biennial and Biennale Warsaw, and is conducted within the framework of the second edition of the Warsaw Biennial that is still taking place these days. So for those in Warsaw, I encourage you to visit the biennial location and to take a look at the exhibition. And again, very thankful to our Polish colleagues who are also here with us now, to Joanna Saran and Pavel, who are kindly assisting this talk. And also I have to say that this series is part of the events that were organized by the East Europe Biennial Alliance and will be continued later on over the summer and fall of this year. So after this Armed Democracy program, we will have also a follow-up taking place in Prague within the second edition of the Prague Biennale of Prague Biennial, then also in Kassel within Documenta 15, and later in Riga at the Survival Kit Festival. Also, a short note before I start introducing our guests tonight, short technical note to our viewers and listeners. This event is live streamed on Warsaw Biennial YouTube channel and Facebook page. So I encourage everybody to leave your comments or questions to our speakers on Facebook chat or YouTube chat, and afterwards I will try voice them to our guests. As for the format, we will have two presentations tonight, approximately 25-30 minutes each, and then we will have a Q&A round with the discussion and questions. So thank you so much again, Oleksiy and Svitlana, that you joined us today. Oleksiy Radynski is a colleague of mine from the Visual Culture Research Center. He's a filmmaker and writer based in Kyiv. His films have been screened at many international festivals, like in Rotterdam, at Kurzfilmtage Oberhausen, Doku Days, the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, among others, and have received a number of festival awards. He is also a co-founder of our Visual Culture Research Center, and his texts have been published in particular Proxy Politics, Power and Subversion in a Networked Age of 2017, Art and Theory of Post-89 Central and East Europe, a Critical Anthology of 2018, and Being Together Precedes Being of 2019, as well as on Eflux Journal. And Svitlana Matviyenko is an assistant professor of critical media analysis in the School of Communication and associate director of the Digital Democracies Institute. Her research and teaching are focused on information and cyber war, political economy of information, media and environment. She is a co-author of Cyber War and Revolution, Digital Subterfuge in Global Capitalism, which was published in 2019. And she is also a winner of the 2019 Book Award of the Science, Technology and Art in International Relations section of the International Studies Association and of the Canadian Communication Association 2020 Gertrude Robinson Book Prize. Thank you so much again. Today's event, as I mentioned, is titled Nuclear Blackmail and Fossil Fascism, and we will be actually discussing a problematic field which somehow is in the basis of this war, but still it's somehow not pretty evident in the public discussions here in Ukraine, but also elsewhere. So it's basically very much dedicated to, in particular, Oleksiy's presentation is very much connected to the topic of the climate emergency and extractivism, and which role the consumption of fossil fuels played in the setting of this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So Oleksiy, I also have to say that Oleksiy's presentation is very much also in line with the artwork, the film that he produced and made, which is also part of the Warsaw Biennial exhibition presented in Warsaw, which is dedicated to the infamous Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So thank you, Oleksiy. The floor is yours now.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Vasil, for the introduction and for having me here. And I have to say, I am very pleased and honored to be in this company, in this kind of setting, together with my very dear friends and comrades, both of whom I know and whose work I follow for very many years. That is Vasil and Svitlana. And yeah, I am really happy that this today's conversation, as well as a number of other contributions to the Warsaw Biennial, really stem from our kind of years-long interaction, communication, yeah, and exchange. Yeah, and thanks a lot, Vasil, also for mentioning my film contribution to the Warsaw Biennial. This is really a kind of exceptional opportunity to really contribute to an event that really kind of transcends the borders of art, the borders of knowledge, and the borders of politics. Yeah, so I would say that my small presentation today is in a way an addendum or an appendix to the film that you can still see if you're in Warsaw, in the Warsaw Biennial, that's called Nord Stream Studies, which is actually a site-specific contribution to this very well-researched, I think, and very well thought-through exhibition about modern extractivism and datafication. And yeah, for some years now, I've been following this story and the development of this now infamous kind of and world infamous, so to say, extractivist joint project between Russian and German political class, yeah, called the Nord Stream. And so the film and the exhibition is based on the found footage that I was able to source from the website of Nord Stream AG, company based in Switzerland. And as I was working on this film, I was kind of horrified by the fact that over time, the topic of this work was getting, unfortunately, more and more pertinent and urgent. I really thought I would be much more glad if the topic of my research became irrelevant over years. But in this case, if it became irrelevant, but unfortunately, exactly the opposite happened. And as I was actually up to the moment when I was basically coming here to this meeting today, I just read an appalling news from a couple of days ago, something that I missed 2 days ago, but apparently on July 6th, the European Parliament has voted for a resolution that accepts or acknowledges natural gas now as a green fuel, as a green energy source, right? I mean, yeah, I'm not sure I want to go into very much detail about this particular piece of news right now, because I think during my presentation there will be a moment to dwell on this in more detail. But I think that, even in the Kafkaesque world of European bureaucracy, this is really something, this is a new height or a new low, so to say. So now officially natural gas is a green fuel, and I think this is going to have really dire consequences, not just for the planetary climate, but also for the war that is now unfolding in Europe. The war that is currently funded mostly by European taxpayers, whose money are flowing into the Russian Federation in exchange for fossil fuel exports and directly fueling the mass murder of Ukrainian citizens. Okay, I think at this moment I would like to go a little bit back in time to a situation that I think is never it's never too much to stress, and back to the situation that allegedly occurred on February 24th, 2022 in Berlin during the meeting of the ministers of the German federal government with the Ukrainian ambassador Andriy Melnik in Berlin, where they were discussing, of course, the invasion of Ukraine, which was launched by the Russian military earlier on that day. And according to the account by Andriy Melnik, at that meeting with the German ministers, he had to confront an opinion by Christian Lindner, a finance minister of Germany, an opinion that only several hours have left until the crushing defeat of Ukraine by the Russian Federation, that the delivery of weapons to Ukraine or sanctions against Russia make no sense. And therefore, instead, one should look into the future and accept the reality of an occupied Ukraine with a puppet government installed by Russia. So, of course, after this account was made public by the Ukrainian ambassador, it's been denied, of course, by the German side. But still, if we look at the German policy with regards to Eastern Europe during the last decade or a couple of decades, this story really sounds credible, I would say, and it's almost unsurprising, in fact. Because in the end, it was no one else but the German government that had agreed to construct the, for instance, Nord Stream gas pipeline that is now linking Russia and Germany directly via the Baltic seabed, and is actually bypassing Ukrainian gas transit routes. So by doing so, by agreeing to construct this pipeline, the German government back in 2011 had made it crystal clear to the Russian elites that the territory of Ukrainian state is actually up for grabs. It's up for them to grab. It seems that by joining this Nord Stream project, Germany, perhaps unwittingly or maybe not, had signaled that all of its talk about Ukraine's role in the European project was actually nothing but hollow rhetoric. Yeah? We know that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine as a newly independent state has been unfortunately and shamefully ascribed with only one real geopolitical role on the European continent. And that was the role of the transit zone that was enabling the deliveries of Russian fossil fuels to their European consumers via the Soviet-era oil and gas pipelines that are buried still in the Ukrainian land. And of course, in that context, the major rationale behind the Nord Stream project on the Russian side was to render this gas transit zone obsolete, yeah, to deprive Ukraine of this geopolitical status. So at the very moment when German government had agreed to strip Ukraine of this transit potency, of this transit status, the stage for the Russian invasion had already been set, in fact. And from today's perspective, this Nord Stream deal really looks like a case of good old imperialism, pure and simple. A deal on territories and resources made by the two kind of imperial European powers. But as often happens in history, this deal, this informal agreement between the two imperial powers had been thrown into complete disarray by one factor that remained out of their reach, and that was Ukrainian popular resistance to the Russian invasion. So as we now know, the Western predictions about the swift collapse of Ukrainian state and of its resistance proved to be completely false. And the reason for this is that they were themselves based on a neo-colonial and technocratic logic, which is usually very poorly informed about what's happening on the ground, yeah, and about the complex dynamics of the societies it is trying to comprehend. But for Ukrainians, of course, it was clear from the start that the future of the occupied Ukraine promised something different than what Minister Lindner could probably imagine at all. It meant mass killings, it meant brutal counterinsurgency, it meant the establishment of concentration camps, and most likely it meant genocide on a scale that was not seen on the European continent since World War II. Yeah, so the popular effort to aid the Ukrainian army had not only saved innumerable lives that would definitely be lost if Ukraine would fall under Russian control, but paradoxically, this resistance had also saved something that did not really deserve to be saved. And I'm speaking here about the reputations of those European politicians and governments that had been really ready to do business as usual with Russia, even if it really morphed already into a fully fascist and mass murderous state. Yeah. So these elites actually made a cautious U-turn with regards to Russia only when it became clear in the kind of early days of the invasion that the Ukrainian resistance had halted the Russian blitzkrieg, yeah, as that something is not going according to the plan. But how come the European elites and also the large part of the general public had been turning a blind eye to an ever more obvious descent of the Russian Federation into openly fascist politics? Yeah, it's like had they not been educated for decades specifically to be able to recognize fascist threats as huge as that one, at least. I mean, wasn't there supposed to be some kind of anti-fascist consensus, at least in German society? Yeah? These are the questions that many of us in Ukraine are now asking really in vain. And of course, one reason for this blindness on the European side lies in deliberate and decades-long obfuscation and discreditation of the terms like anti-fascism and fascism by the Russian regime itself. Yeah, so we know that for years the Russian Federation has been cultivating a kind of habit of arbitrarily labeling anyone who is opposed to Putin's rule as a Nazi. Yeah, it's been, of course, planting in the same time neo-Nazi groups in nearly every post-Soviet state to be able to claim later that it has to save ethnic Russians from them. Yeah, unfortunately, in Ukraine, some of these groups spiraled out of Russia's control, while objectively they were still fulfilling the Kremlin's goals. Yeah, that is sowing division. Of course, the Russian regime has also been very much capitalizing on the Western ignorance fairly with regards to the history of World War II, which allowed Moscow to claim successfully that, quote unquote, the Russian army had liberated Germany from the Nazis, end of quote. Of course, it's always worth reminding that the Russian army did not liberate Germany from the Nazis simply because the Russian army did not exist during World War II. Yeah, what defeated the Nazis was the Red Army, which was an internationalist armed forces of the USSR, comprised of several dozens of nationalities, including Russians, of course. But every time the Red Army is mislabeled as the Russian army, we are dealing with the colonial erasure of numerous other nations, some of which had been affected by that war to a disproportionate extent. But had the West been less perceptive to Putin's gaslighting with regards to the Nazi problem, it would undoubtedly be able to recognize that what we're dealing with in Russia has a very clear definition in political science, and that's fascism. So indeed, in order to identify today's regime in Russia as a textbook fascist regime, we really didn't have to wait for Putin to publicly declare a war that's based on the denial of the right to exist to a certain ethno-political group. That's fascist. We didn't have to wait for the Russian state media to publish calls for the physical extermination of Ukrainian identity. And we didn't have to wait for the Russian troops to start executing these calls in the occupied territories of Ukraine. For a very, very long time before all of these things happened, the ideological trajectory of the Russian regime has been clear. And the Russian elites has been very open about their neo-fascist leanings for years and even decades. And of course, it became almost a commonplace to stress that the political agenda of Eurasianism that Kremlin is pursuing for some decades has been shaped by the likes of the Russian openly fascist philosopher, pseudo-philosopher Alexander Dugin. And of course, a lot has been said about Ivan Ilyin, Hitler sympathizer of the interwar period, who had recently gained the status of the most influential Russian thinker of the 20th century because he is apparently Putin's favorite philosopher. And of course, there is no shortage of historical parallels between contemporary Russian fascism and its historical predecessors. Like on the level of political economy, of course, the origins of Russian fascism are rooted in a way that the end of the Cold War had been handled by the victorious West. Just as the origins of the German Nazism are attributed, are rooted in the way that Germany has been treated after its defeat in World War I at the Versailles Treaty. So the populations of both of these countries have really been subjected to massive economic punishments for the defeats that were suffered by their elites, while the elites had, of course, not been punished. And in those cases, this led to quite similar outcomes. So just as German Nazism had been a product, in a way, or partly at least, of the hyperinflation in the 1920s Germany, in the same way the Russian fascism of today is actually a product of hyperinflation of the 1990s in the Russian Federation. But it would be really wrong to see today's Russian fascism as a mere reenactment of this kind of historical fascist movements of the past. It's just as historical fascism has been the product of class antagonisms and failed revolutions of the early 20th century. So today's fascisms emerge as reactions to the ongoing contemporary struggles worldwide. And most importantly, the struggles are decolonial, anti-patriarchal struggles and ecological struggles. And so with regards to the decolonial component, of course, the Russian Federation had itself exposed the colonial character of its invasion of Ukraine to a sufficient degree. And the same can be said about the anti-feminist and male chauvinist agenda that is pursued by Russia itself towards its own population, but also pursued by Russia's puppets everywhere in places like Hungary, but also in a kind of mirror regimes like what we currently have in Poland. But still, the ecological dimension of this new Russian fascism has been evading really the European public discourse for a very long time. It's been really almost absent there, I think. And in fact, this absence comes really as no surprise, because raising the issue of the Russian fossil fuels and their dual role in the destruction both of the planetary climate and the European democracy would expose the complicity of the Western elites, and first and foremost German elites and governments, their complicity with the emergence of new fascism on the continent. Quite recently, this new looming planetary threat has been given a concise and quite catchy name of fossil fascism. Yeah? In eponymous book by Andreas Malm, the Zetkin Collective, that's whose full title reads "White Face, Black Fuel: On the Dangers of Fossil Fascism." And so Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective really convincingly argue in this book that the threat of fossil fascism, a new kind of fascism in the 21st century, emerges right now from this kind of worldwide alliance of multi-billion fossil industries that are fearing decline due to their obvious role in the climate catastrophe, and the far-right movements worldwide that also happen to be increasingly climate denialist. Yeah? But the problem with their approach, I think, is that the authors of this book see this kind of power takeover by the fossil fascist regimes as a kind of future threat, which is possible but not inevitable. And they see it as a future threat rather than an immediate reality of today. And this is, of course, I think, dictated by the geography of their research in this groundbreaking book, which is unfortunately limited to the US, Brazil, and Western Central Europe. But the Russian Federation, which is almost, I mean, it is barely even mentioned in this research, and we are now, and this comes as a very big surprise, because we are talking about one of the biggest exporters of both fossil fuels and far-right ideologies. So this is such a huge elephant in the room, where Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective are trying to break new paths without actually even trying to touch this elephant. But actually, if we look closely at the emergence of Putinism, which is both a far-right ideology and an extractivist economic model, so this would make it clear that the model of fossil fascism has not at all been pioneered by the likes of Trump or Le Pen, as Malm and the Zetkin Collective seem to suggest. Actually, it's been around and it's been in power for quite some time now, since at least early 2000s, when the Kremlin had consolidated its grip over the Russian fossil fuel industry, while in the same time starting to pursue its aggressive revanchist far-right ideology both at home and abroad. So of course it's been noted by quite a few political scientists that the economies that are based on the extraction of fossil fuels usually tend to transform into autocracies. So the centralization of power and the increased role of security apparatus and this kind of sense of availability of seemingly unlimited resources that are often the effects of fossil fuel extractivist model, they all enhance also authoritarian power models. And this also allows to export these models outside their own political systems of these extractivist economies. As we now see, the Russian Federation is now exporting authoritarian models along with their oil and its natural gas to Western Europe, for instance. But what I think demands much closer attention with regards to understanding the origins of fossil fascism in Russia is the fact that the fossil fuel industry of the Russian Federation itself, which is an enormous transcontinental infrastructure for the extraction and transportation of oil and gas, and it's spanning from Siberia to Western Europe. So this very infrastructure has been key to the dissolution of the Soviet communism, the way it has been dissolved. And of course, it's been also key, therefore, to the emergence of this kleptocratic extractivist far-right regime on the ruins of the Soviet Union in Russia. Yeah? And we know that since the 1980s, since the early 1980s, the USSR and Western Germany, I repeat, Western Germany and not Eastern Germany, had been connected via this enormous transcontinental natural gas pipeline that was dubbed at the time the deal of the century by the Soviet historians. And that's been a subject of a massive and very long dispute and series of international scandals since the 1960s, because this project was fiercely opposed by the US. If we read the history of the so-called deal of the century these days, it seems like really it's very hard to avoid a very strong sense of deja vu with regards to the current discussions of the last decade about whether Germany should have built this infrastructure that makes it so dependent on Russian gas or not. Yeah, but the West German government at the time, in the 1980s and 70s, had argued in a kind of dialectical materialist way that doing a kind of gas business with the USSR on such a gigantic scale does not really pose any security threat, as the Americans were claiming, but to the contrary, the West German calculation was that when the Soviet elites are faced with the prospect of such an enormous profit as the one that was made possible by this kind of seemingly endless gas extraction, these elites would be themselves seduced by the prospect of becoming capitalist, and that will lead them to abandon the communist project. Yeah, and this threat will go away somehow, miraculously. And of course, this may have seemed very far-fetched and improbable, but we have to accept now that this is exactly what happened in 1991. Yeah, what happened was the top-down dissolution, actually, of the Soviet Union by the party elites, which led to this kind of unprecedented privatization of profits generated by the fossil industry. Yeah, so we know now that during the post-Soviet decades, these profits had been converted, first of all, of course, into exorbitant wealth for the lucky few in Russia, but also they've been converted into kind of resurgent military apparatus and this aggressive foreign policy that's breeding on revanchist bullshit fed to the Russian population by the propaganda machine. Yeah, and in the meantime, this extractivist infrastructure of the post-Soviet Russia had been growing rapidly, yeah, due to this kind of new lucrative Russian-German deals like the Nord Stream. And this, of course, was keeping Europe in this really sleepy illusion that as long as the Russian elites are able to get their ultra profits from their fossil fuel exports, their fascist rhetoric will not be converted into military action because, as they thought, business does miracles. Yeah, Wandel durch Handel, so to say. And then, of course, came February 24th, 2022. I'm afraid I'm a bit over time now, but I'm really to wrap up. I want to make just one last point, and I think that it's really important to stress that even though we know that The Russian Federation these days is presenting itself as kind of staunchly anti-Western force, yeah, as a kind of bearer of Orientalist, Eurasianist model. But I think that nothing really expresses this ideological manipulation behind Russian fossil fascism better than this attempt to reject its own Western origin, yeah, because like any other fascism known to history, Russian fascism is nothing but an ugly byproduct of the Western capitalist development. Yeah? More specifically, fossil fascism as it emerged in Russia is a direct product of Europe's dealings with its own resource periphery. Yeah? So in fact, Russian fascism is pure and simple Western fascism in its new iteration. And the failure of Europe to recognize its own role in the emergence of Russian fossil fascism may really lead to far bigger disasters than the ones that we are witnessing right now in Ukraine. Yeah, I'm sorry if I was speaking too long.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Oleksiy. Yeah, I think like what you just outlined is a kind of a very logical and natural link to Svitlana's presentation, which is titled Nuclear Blackmail and Cyberterror. Because in this regard, you can please, Svitlana, switch on, turn on your camera and microphone already. But because what actually strikes me in this regard, that somehow paradoxically, it's as we all know that like you, Oleksiy, mentioned at the very beginning, this new European Union decision to recognize natural gas as a kind of green, so to say, fuel. But basically, as we remember some years ago, right, it was exactly Germany which was so much shocked and afraid of Fukushima tragedy that they just refused to use nuclear energy, right, and nuclear power plants of their own, and switched to totally to the dependence on Russian fossil fuels. And now, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, what they met actually was occupied Chernobyl, right, power plant, which I think is a kind of a irony of history, or I don't know how to frame it, but that's exactly what Svitlana is going to talk about. But because, as I said, it's Svitlana's talk is titled "Nuclear Blackmail and Cyberterror," and actually, what I think is really crucial in this regard is that, like, we, after this full-scale invasion, rather before the 24th of February, right, we here in Ukraine, but also elsewhere in general in the West, we had been constantly hearing these blackmail and threats coming from the military side in terms of nuclear weaponry, right? But then afterwards, it appeared that nuclear energy can be also weaponized. So it's really an absolutely unprecedented case of a global scale, I would say. So the floor is yours, Svitlana, and especially interesting how this is all connected to the idea of cyber war, the way that Russia is pursuing so much today. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Vasil. And I'm going to share my slides. So at this moment, you should be seeing the screen with my slides. Yes, I want to thank everyone for organizing this event and for coming to listen to us, and hopefully for the question and exchanges afterwards. And indeed, I will also want to thank Oleksiy for providing such a fantastic kind of wide framework and context for situating these discussions that I want to do now around nuclear blackmail and cyber terror. So partly my presentation will be based on my earlier work, one published article in eFlux, which actually is called Nuclear Cyber War. but also on my even earlier work with Nick Beresford, the book about cyberwar revolution, where we theorized cyber war as a global rebooting of capitalism. And something like this we are also seeing today, and I hope to explain kind of some things that I think are important here. All right, so in the focus of this talk will be this nexus of cyber and nuclear. And it was very interesting for me how like this two streams of my work, which I always considered kind of somewhat separate, and in all my possible research statements and justifications of what I do and explaining of who I am as a researcher, I was having a hard time to actually connecting these two things and explaining to everyone how I do that and this. And so what we see now is a kind of some terrifying merge of precisely these two seemingly different themes, topics, as a nuclear research or like Chernobyl research and research on global militarism and cyber war. So this nexus is in focus. And before I speak about some details, I also want to pay attention to a couple of terms and put them in relation to some other works that I had in mind when I defined with this particular phenomenon, that situation, as nuclear cyber war. One of the very important kind of references for me now and for the book Cyberwar and Revolution was an article by Eric Gartsky and John Lindsay published in 2017, which was called Thermonuclear Cyber War. I will talk about it in detail, so I won't focus on it right now, but the article, as you see here, refers another book, which was a famous book published in 1960 by Herman Kahn, who was an American thinker, part of Rand Corporation think tanks, and that book was on thermonuclear war. In that book, Kahn was very concerned about this new type of war where a nuclear weapon can be engaged, and he talked about some potential deadly consequences of that war. He talked about different strategies, some of which will be also very important for our conversation. And his book also was not without a reference, without a kind of like thematical and conceptual reference, which remains kind of a key text for any theorizations about war until today, which is a book on war from the 19th century from Karl von Clausewitz. And this is, of course, a very important text, which supplied us with a lot of terms that are still in conversation even today when the war really turned cyber. Such words as a fog of war, there's unclarity, and this and this and that, including that very famous line that war is a policy by other means. So anyway, I will be maybe referring back to this kind of conceptual chronology where this notion nuclear cyber war comes from or refers to certain ideas. So I thought it would be useful to see how this building of the theory develops. And now I want to kind of focus your attention on this particular article by Gartsky and Lindsay, Thermonuclear Cyber War. This article is very good for a variety of reasons, and if to any extent you're interested in these matters, in the matters of, again, war, nuclear, militarism, anything cyber, I really advise you to have a look at this. Today, I am mentioning it basically because of this very important observation, the comparison that they make there or rather a distinction between nuclear weapons and cyber operations, also some type of weapons, right? Because as you hear probably in the whole title, thermonuclear cyber war, they bring these kind of, the awareness and fear of anything thermonuclear or nuclear, plus new type of threats, which is anything cyber. So they try to kind of both distinguish, compare, and to see what is the relation between these two types of weapons and whether indeed they in some way come together in the current context. So what they notice is quite interesting there and very useful for us to think about the current situation. So when they write about the nuclear weapons, they know that nuclear weapons have the unprecedented destructiveness, right? So nobody can deny that. At the same time, while being so destructive, they are almost never used. And in fact, we probably just mention and know just a couple of usage of nuclear weapons in history. However, nuclear weapons are constantly, we can say, in conversation since the origins, since their existence. They're always in conversation in all sorts of political discussions and in kind of like growing conflicts and decreasing conflicts, but somehow they're always in conversation. So there are some particular characteristics of nuclear weapons that is quite important and interesting here, which is this public display. The public display of the nuclear arsenals and this whole, we can say, strategy of deterrence. The idea of deterrence comes actually from Kant's book, right? So from the book on the nuclear war in the 60s. And this is a particular strategy of negotiations, maybe a little kind of aggressive, maybe a little too aggressive, because again, nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and nuclear threat is in conversation. Knowledge of nuclear capabilities is necessary to achieve a deterrent effect, they write. Unlike nuclear weapons, cyber operations or any kind of cyber weapons are constantly used, but they are not so destructive, according to these two authors. And by cyber weapons and cyber operations, they mean all possible leaks, hacking, disabling of critical infrastructure, and you can probably DDoS attacks, and you can probably think of more and more and more total variety of different things. And we hear all the time, it's all used, but in most cases, it creates some noise, but the systems learn so well to recover, and vulnerabilities are so many, but at the same time, like this recovery and fixing the vulnerabilities is pretty fast, which we saw themselves just before February 24th, right? So when we have days of massive attacks that Fedorov told us, our Minister of Information, right? So he told us it was like the waves of attacks were unprecedented, and yet myself, I only read about them online, but I didn't even experience any interaction of my banking system, although I know that my bank was constantly under attack, right? So, but I didn't sense this. I only read about it. So in a certain way, we can see how like there is a lot of threat, a lot of kind of drama and hysteria around potential of cyber weapons, but however, no devastation. So, and they conclude saying here, the last line of the citations is the diversity of cyber operation and confusion about their effects also contrast with the obvious destructiveness of nuclear weapons. At the same time, in the same article, they also make another very interesting conclusion that these two things, cyber and nuclear, are coming particularly complementary. And I must say, we can also notice how fast things develop and change, because this article was written in the 16th and was published in 2017. And today, even though we find this distinction quite useful, we can also see a kind of a new scenario of merging one with another, where we see a really kind of like some incredible potential for destructiveness, specifically because cyber merges with nuclear, right? So this is one of the things, one of the developments, one of the new phenomena here that we see in this current war is this particular merge. So more thinking is needed on that relation and about these two different types of weapons. When we were writing a book about cyber war, this nexus of cyber and nuclear was already present there, but not so vividly. So one of the most representative cases of that was the famous Stuxnet malicious computer war, which was discovered in 2010, and that was a program manufactured together by the US government and Israeli government to attack Iranian nuclear power plant. The goal and the function of that virus was, and it had to be implanted manually, as you see this little flash drive there, because it was brought to the station somehow on the flash drive. So, but still it was a program, right? So it had a very important cyber component, and that virus was supposed to dive into centrifuges working on the production of certain elements, chemical elements, and break them. So that was a state-of-art worm, which wasn't even recognized as anything digital. It completely looked as a mechanical malfunction. However, that case became a really interesting intersection of cyber and nuclear. But thinking about the current intersection, we can see, and that's what I was also trying to do in my early work, to kind of oppose them or even distinguish in some way. So unlike Stuxnet, that was, which intent was to slow down the Iranian nuclear program, and in a certain way, even de-weaponize it, even itself, it was a weapon, right? But what we see now with the occupation and literally terrorist acts on the territories of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and now in the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant, right? So which Vasil already mentioned can be really identified as a weaponization of peaceful infrastructures. Although peaceful here again is another little bit problematic term, because as some scientists are telling me, nuclear power and nuclear industry is never fully located in kind of the realm of something completely peaceful, right? So the specifics of that infrastructure, that it also always has to do something with the military, with security, with nuclear weapons, and et cetera, right? So it's et cetera. But still, now I just want to frame it like this because of the dependence on particularly Zaporizhzhya nuclear power infrastructure, the dependence on that energy for peace, right? So for everyday life. So that was really, in this sense, it was weaponization of the peaceful infrastructure, turning it into a weapon. And therefore, unlike Stuxnet, accelerating certain processes, accelerating certain military processes. So when we think about this nexus of cyber and nuclear, I also want to address it through with the following idea. You probably hear a lot when someone refers or speaks about this current war as even there are several different wars are going on now on the territory of Ukraine. I prefer actually seeing it as one war. And I learned and I used to seeing that complexity, like not being afraid to see a certain complexity of war as one phenomena. However, I want to distinguish several vectors. And these vectors, and I will explain later why it would be important to distinguish these several vectors of this very complex one war, which is again, of course, capitalist, imperial, fossil fuel war. And you can think of other definitions for it. And at least now I see two of these vectors. Maybe there are more. I see two at this moment. So we can speak about the inter-imperial war as a vector, right? So where a number of empires or former empires or current empires are participating in this war. Russian Empire is the most obvious, but of course there is Europe and Europe's European imperial legacy, right? There is the US and whatnot. So there are kind of a number of different imperial agents that are participating here. And of course, there is another vector that has to do primarily with Russia and Ukraine and Russian aggression on Ukrainian territory. And there are a couple of reasons why it would be important and useful, I think, to keep the distinction of these vectors in mind and in conversation. And I will begin with inter-imperial war first, before I move to Russia-Ukraine. So when we look at this vector, we can see certain specifics that are not foreign, of course, to Russia-Ukraine vector 2. But here we more see the redistribution or rebooting of global power, which is happening here. But we also see what can be called the rebooting of fossil fuel capitalism. And what Oleksiy mentioned before is very useful for this particular understanding, because when you hear how gas becomes green, that's precisely a rebooting or reconceptualization of fossil fuel capitalism, right? So, and also, of course, there are other things here. In this inter-imperial war, with this tactic or strategy of deterrence, which we already learned is inherited from most early kind of theories or understandings of the nuclear war, is very important. And we can see how it has been engaged immediately with the full-scale invasion, but it was also engaged prior to it, right? So it was always in the conversation. So let's look at these couple of aspects of this deterrence as strategy and as practice, right? So it's a practice of how threats or limited force by one party can convince another party to refrain from initiating some other course of action. Deterrence is widely defined as any use of threats, implicit or explicit, or limited force intended to dissuade an actor from taking an action. Deterrence is most likely to be successful when a prospective attacker believes that the probability of success is low and the cost of attacks are high. So, and that's precisely kind of, we can recognize a lot of this, aspects of this strategy or tactic of deterrence. And when I say strategy or tactics, so when I say strategy, I always mean something long lasting, right? So strategy is something that started some long time ago, and tactic is a particular claim, maybe still belonging to certain discourse of deterrence, but is applied at this particular moment now, right? So here deterrence could be strategic and tactical at the same time. And this deterrence, even if it looks like quite an aggressive kind of situation and practice, in a certain way, I suspect might not even be like kind of so aggressive in this inter-imperial war. What's interesting, or at least what seems to me is kind of problematic, is that the confrontation within the inter-imperial war is not so real. And I came to this idea when with Nick Dyer-Wisford we were working on the theory of cyberwar, and that's when we were trying to kind of think about whether or not that confrontation could be identified as a new Cold War. But the difference, and Cold War, of course, you know, at that time, some 50 years ago, there was a confrontation. Something changed today because this binary between opposed models of society and opposed modes of production, opposed ideologies, is no longer present. With the global capitalism, we entered a kind of a new era where no Cold War is really possible. It might be only probably as a game of rhetoric, ticklish deterrence, we could say it, right? Because in fact, kind of certain complicity between all these new and old imperial powers is more important than their confrontation. And if you read like other texts about this, so we can see that this imperialist countries are increasingly today dependent on each other through the nexus of world trade, and all global business systems and etc. So a collective imperialism. So it's really a collective imperialism now that we are observing here, and that's what dominates world economy. To me, what this these terms and this discussion explains a lot about the way how sanctions work, or how something falls through constantly, or how there are always some ways of which everybody knows to avoid sanctions and to carry on some trades, or how sometimes always constantly is lifted when it's needed. Was Canada now also participating in lifting some restrictions and allowing certain trades again and whatnot? Right, so this is happening. So in a sense, with all this kind of, you know, dramatic idea of, you know, sanctioning and restraining Russia as an imperialist power falls through in the end because of this dependence. And this dependence is really defining a lot of things now. So this is a kind of, from this, on this vector brings us to very dark scenarios about where this war is going and what potential ends or endless developments of this war may be. And now I'll jump to another one, which is the vector of Russia-Ukraine. And here immediately I will mention that the reason I distinguish them, and because we speak today about blackmail, so here I can see, or at least it seems to me, and I will be very thankful for your comments and thoughts about this, because it's a very kind of recent observation, that on the vector imperial war, we can see the practice of deterrence activated on the cyber nuclear nexus. But the vector of Russia-Ukraine really activates the practice of terror and blackmail. And the difference between these two is significant because deterrence, as we already saw, right? So it's kind of like threatening and negotiation, right? So it's a continuation of discussion. But the practice of terror has to do with violence, has to do with erasure of culture, has to do with even genocide. All right. So again, this vector tells us still tells us about this war as being capitalist fossil nuclear, but it also brings these other dimensions that we all in Ukraine aware about and talk a lot about these days, about particular symbolism of Ukraine in the Russian imperial imaginary, about certain symptomatic position of Ukraine for Russia, right? So as Russia sees Ukraine as something extremely important for its own self-identity. Then again, imperial and colonial legacies are extremely powerful there. And what I already mentioned, the war of erasure. I'll say a couple of words about nuclear colonialism, because that's precisely what I discovered when I was thinking about weaponization of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant as a nuclear, turning it into a nuclear weapon. So very briefly, and if I don't have enough time to develop this idea, please, I refer you to my eFlux article on this matter. So I spoke there about the territories of Polisia, where nuclear power station was kind of set to build, but it wasn't the only one, not the only object of basically Cold War. There was also Duga radar that was built very close to the nuclear power plant. And it is, and that was precisely very kind of hardcore Cold War object, right? And it is precisely the presence of these two objects imposed a certain military and securitization regime on those areas and communities. And then if you look at the map of the Chernobyl zone, the 10 kilometers and the 30 kilometers, you would realize that this Chernobyl zone was in a certain way prefigured before 1986. It was a kind of almost pre-constructed by these securitization regimes and where these two objects were located, right? So here is, you see the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and with these objects near the orange line at the bottom, this is Chernobyl 2 or Duga radar. And that you can see the Tyatki where 30 kilometer, the border of the 30 kilometer zone goes, right? So this zone was set around these two objects and by the securitization and military regime, basically in a certain way disturbing, troubling, problematizing the life of these communities, ecology of this whole area, and of course, lives of these people. That another map, which kind of also about this idea. So when we speak about that was a nuclear colonial dimension of that. But now I just want to focus a little more on terror specifically. And when you think of terror, so some scholars of terrorism tell us that terror is a premeditated and unlawful act. A premeditated and unlawful act of terrorism can be committed either by rebels or governments. And it can be isolated, but it can also take place in the context of a war. The essence of terrorism is surely the negation of combat, which is also a very interesting idea, especially in the context of the current war. It targets the attacked in a way that inhibits or better prohibits self-defense. So in a certain way, the act of terror negates combat. And as we know, from what we know now, because the Russian army seemed that they didn't plan actually to have much of combat and were hoping for very fast blitzkrieg. So in a certain way, this whole military endeavor was planned as the act of terror by those strikes, by certain killings, by occupation, let's say, of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant to scare because it's symbolic and whatnot. Now, situation changed, right, as we know, and there is some combat, but that's how the war at least looked from the very beginning. And that also gives us an argument towards actual and realness of planned terror from the beginning of the war. We, of course, can mention the burning Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant, which itself was terrifying and an act of terror, and many other things. But I want to now stop on a couple of cases which also gives us some thoughts about certain pressure and terrorizing of people under occupation that still need more discussion and thinking. For example, I saw this very interesting interview with Lyudmila Kozak given to Suspilne, but she also gave many interviews, and she is one of the engineers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and she spent some time under the occupation. So when she is asked whether there was some pressure and whether Russian soldiers who occupied were violent, she denies it. And she rather turns the narrative kind of to present something. She speaks about responsibilities that the workers of Chernobyl nuclear power plant had, and that's why they were acting there. It was very interesting for me to listen to this narrative, right? So, but we also need to think about certain meanings there. Probably certain ideas about pressure and labor are not still developed like on our territories among our workers group, maybe because of the kind of lack of worker movement, because we don't engage and negotiate and bargain and etc. here, right? So there is no nuanced discourse about various different aspects of labor and what and which in these very complex labor practices may be identified as terror or pressure. It's very interesting for me that this woman actually does not identify it as such. However, if you imagine this whole situation, if you are the worker of a nuclear power plant and you are there and it's occupied and people do not know how to run it, you actually can imagine that if you don't do your work, something terrible may happen. So in a certain way, right, so an aspect of terror even present there. And I am quite interested to think more about what this particular case and the discussions about labor, under occupation, etc. So Petro Kotin, who is the director of Energoatom, when he speaks about the cases of occupation of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant, he mentions one interesting thing about 2000s, when he says in 2000s, Putin had that idea that even despite the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the nuclear energy still has to be won. and it still has to be managed from the Moscow office. So in a certain way, despite the dissolution of that imperial country, he saw the energy or certain things like that kind of, still living and being saved by its previous kind of imperial connections and power relations. So in a certain way, we can say that the occupation of nuclear power plants was kind of reenactment of that same imperial fantasy. And especially today, we actually, it's probably somewhere later, but I also mentioned that today we hear from Energoatom that in September, allegedly, someone from the occupiers being there at Zaporizhzhya nuclear power station says that from September, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station will belong to Energoatom. So this sense of getting back the nuclear energy infrastructure is still there. And it's still related to this 23-year-old or 22-year-old fantasy. We also see very different acts of terror very recently. And this is literally already the end of June and the beginning of July. So we hear now more and more stories about kidnapping and torture of the workers of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, something completely different from what we heard in the narratives of the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power station under occupation. The context is different here too, of course, right? And this context is again about, and the reason here is again about a possibility to integrate this nuclear power plant, the most powerful in Europe, to the Russian infrastructure. From what I know from my conversation with different people in the circles of nuclear energy and radiobiology and etc., it is not obviously easy to operate a nuclear power station. I heard that to prepare people, the group of people, the team of people who would be able to operate a station may take like 7-10 years. Because there is a lot of almost kind of tacit knowledge involved there. Sometimes I was told they, of course, kind of big, great scientists, but there is a lot of what and how they do is also based on certain almost intuitive knowledge. And this is not something that someone can just tell. And in a certain way, with these people who are now used as a literary resource, I'm just guessing that the reason of someone is being tortured is because of this particular knowledge that someone wants to really squeeze out of them by terror, which is not possible. So this presents a really kind of like terrifying situation. On the one level, it's of course the life of people, these particular people. On the other level is that they continue to either disconnect the nuclear power plant from some kind of controlling systems, to want to, cool out, get rid of the cooling pond, to do something else. So they constantly do a certain disorganized acts, which can be absolutely read as an act of terror. So that's what we've been experiencing and seeing now in the context of, again, this occupation and this war. And it's very difficult, in fact, to predict how this all may end. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so now we are all here. Yeah, thanks so much for these really so much insightful contributions. I also, just in case, again, I remind our audience on Facebook and YouTube channel, if you would consider leaving your comments or questions on the respective chats, and I will try to pick up them as well. I mean, I also have so many different questions going in various directions, but somehow trying to unite them to pose them to both of you. This is indeed so much symptomatic that somehow maybe, I don't know whether you would agree or not, but that it is exactly this war that has been really very much shaped and stylized on the scale of the Second World War, but at the same time it's somehow also, I mean, the very idea and the conceiving this war was also very much like trying sort of from at least what I just heard from both of you, somehow to draw lessons from the Cold War period, from the 90s, from the current technological opportunities, really encompassing war. So much really huge spectrum of various possibilities that have been employed or are to be employed still. But also I'm wondering, because somehow this refers to both of your, the point that you both mentioned, because what we know, also from this kind of a bit also old-fashioned discourse, that basically the strategy when it comes to nuclear issues or to fossil fuels and energy issues, this strategy some time ago, I suppose it was also formulated already in the Cold War era, the idea of escalation to de-escalate, right? That the aggressor basically knows his or her weak spots. So, but he, in this case, he for sure recognizes his basic force in certain direction, right? In both of these directions. So, and he basically recruits all the possible opportunities here in order to embrace all of them, so that there would be no deterrence possible as such, right? So in this sense, to what Oleksiy has said, I think that in both cases, whether it comes to nuclear or to energy issues, we see as a kind of counter-deterrence gesture, basically not really counter-deterrence, but somehow one can say half measures, right? Well, when it comes to sanctions, which were imposed by various Western countries and by the West as such, it's somehow trying to counter-deter the constant blackmail from the Russian side, but still, as we heard, even natural gas is now being considered as a green fuel. The same comes to nuclear. But what strikes me here is that one could hardly even imagine before that all the setting, in what you were both describing, somehow directly leads to a genuine world war, right? I mean, all the setting point out at exactly this direction. But at the same time, it seems like that from the other side, from the West side, I'm not speaking here about Ukraine for obvious reasons, right? there is kind of a no willingness or incapability to employ counter-deterrence forces here. But is there any way, like you see that it is possible to do that? Because like what Oleksiy was saying, because now we also constantly observe, of course, it's again a blackmail, right? That the Russian Federation is currently cutting the gas supplies itself, right? Like towards the European consumers, or like, but we have never heard from the US, of course, especially that there would be a kind of a willingness to pose this nuclear threat as a counter-deterrence gesture. But is there any possibility, I mean, to take the same means that we are being threatened by and to use them as a counter-deterrence gesture? Is there any possibility of this kind of development? Or is just one way, sort of Einbahnstraße, as Benjamin used to say, is just one road, one way ticket that you cannot make any U-turn here, or like to detour somehow these threats to the aggressor side? Are there any possibilities, at least conceptually or theoretically for that matter? What's your take on this? Sorry, you are muted, Svitlana.
I'll just say that I don't see a possibility for appearing anything like a nuclear threat in the discourse of the US. First of all, it's a super traumatic experience, right? So, and the legacy. So there are millions of reasons why they are not going to do this. And why should they, right? So, I mean, obviously, I even hear some critical accounts about even obsessing about the discourse of a potential nuclear threat, right? So it seems like what I see is certain attention, but at the same time, it seems to me that the strategy is even to kind of, you know, sort of push it away, even discursively, not to basically, not to spread it further, because it already achieved a certain crazy dimension, etc., right? So another thing that I want to mention is, again, I wanted to return to with this idea of not distinguishing, but opposing in a certain way, as I'm trying to do now, deterrence and terror, right? Even though deterrence may have a hint of terror in it, but what's important about this, that it is never realized. So kind of, again, going back to the mid-20th century and all sort of cybernetic calculations and games, right? So in the end, this is a chicken game. The chicken game is who is the first, who's chicken out, basically. So, but the whole point is to never do anything. It literally massage of the affects with a good demonstration of what you have. So the demonstration is important to raise the cost of, like, to raise the idea of realness, but then it's a lot of psychology there at the same time. So that's what kind of I take, or that's how I see the entire deterrence as a way of negotiation. Terror, and as you see, terror, I use it, or I think of it when I think about particularly Russia-Ukraine vector. Terror is not a negotiation. Terror is about genocidal erasure of people. by strategic action, by random action. But as we all know, randomness is just part of the system anyway, right? So it's not coincidences. They are systematic coincidences, right? And so in all different aspects of this war, we see the acts of terrorism. However, again, if you zoom out, you can see how this particular terror is used to threaten someone else too, right? So we can see how these vectors, they are, one moment they are separate, then they are coming together, right? So that's why it's very important for me to see it not as different wars, as many people say, but as one war. However, but this fluctuation is very important. Some, like the way of distancing them at some point, but then bringing them together is one of the very interesting kind of, ways of how cyber war and nuclear cyber war is led overall. Right. So in this way, so I when we speak about deterrence, I want to mention another tactic, the tactic of terror, that is completely constantly mobilized, and that I think might be a useful argument for us to think about when we think about these war crimes and whatnot. So that in a certain way, we hear ourselves being terrorized and being objects of terror for other deterrence games, which are about very smooth connections between different imperial powers who indeed wait until everything will just function well all together at whatever cost. That's my impression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Oleksiy, maybe you can also add to this, because it's actually because like when I compare like both of your inputs, it somehow it's just not like fossil fascism, right? We are talking about really like nuclear fascism, basically, of an unprecedented scale. But I'm also wondering, apart from this obvious, in terms of renewables and so on, obvious idea that the United Europe has to cut off the energy supplies from a fascist regime, which is, but is there any like options how to use this weaponry that the fascist aggressor is currently employing against the aggressor itself? It's somehow what I'm myself somehow struggling with, like, are there any options like that we can also draw something from history, or like what are the possibilities here really?
Yeah, I think first of all, it would really not be a good idea if the so-called West or the US followed suit in this way of nuclear blackmail, not just because it's dangerous, but because one of the biggest challenges that we are facing in this war, that everyone is facing, maybe is in any war, is not to become infected by the enemy itself, not to become as evil as your enemy. And this is a very big challenge that not just Ukraine is facing, but the rest of the world as well. So in that sense, there is at least some kind of moral superiority on at least one of the sides. But speaking of the fossil part of the equation, I think, of course, you already partly gave an answer. So because the European Union and especially Germany were proved to be unable to implement an embargo of Russian gas because they foolishly made themselves so dependent on it. So right now, Russia will introduce an embargo of their own gas to Germany. And I don't know, how traumatic and how problematic it's going to be for the European economy, the German economy, and so on. But I think it will definitely be good for our planet. Yeah, if we try to look at this from a completely kind of detached perspective. Maybe it won't be good for Ukraine, but I mean, okay, so you didn't want to decrease consumption of Russian gas because of rational reasons that were provided by all kinds of scientists. So you will have to cut off to stop burning Russian gas because you will not have any, because Russia will not send you any. Of course, it's partly dark joke because yeah, they will burn the freedom gas from the US, and the US is going to profit from this time. But yeah, okay, I don't have. Yeah. I think right now it's hard for me to lecture all of these people on what they should do. It's much more kind of rational to lecture them on what they shouldn't have done. But yeah, it was which was quite obvious. By the way, I forgot to say that not just natural gas is now deemed a green energy source, but also nuclear energy by the same decision of the European Parliament. Nuclear energy and natural gas are not green. Yeah, just summarize.
Yeah, and also, like Svitlana was also mentioning this difference between this war and the sort of typical metrics of the Cold War, that it is not longer present, obviously, and this kind of comparisons with the Cold War are basically not really legitimate, right? But at the same time, I have a kind of a problem here because I think this this interdependence, like also what Oleksiy was describing and what you just, Svitlana, told, it's not just that this is a kind of a weaponization of all the means possible, like, right? What was brought to the table on the table, so it's like unavoidably will become a kind of a weapon of that or another manner. But at the same time, I think that it's somehow in parallel to these kind of conditions, what we already could historically observe in the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, before the First World War, right? I mean, like to make all these arguments about multilateralism and those international agreements so much present and defining our interdependent economies, like you also, I think, mentioned the term collective imperialism, right? This dominance of the world economy. But actually, this is to a certain extent what we also observed in the late, at the beginning of the 20th century, which also somehow this period could be also called a kind of a proto-globalization, or a kind of one of the historical phases of the globalization movement, right? That, so to a certain extent, this is not just a repetition of the previous one, but so in this sense, I'm really wondering whether this interdependence protects us from the development towards all-out world or global war, or the opposite, that it fuels, right, these possibilities to achieve this stage as much as possible. So in this regard, because like to what as parallel, another historical parallel to what Oleksiy was describing, that basically, as you also know, from Timothy Snyder and others, that somehow that one of the reasons to which was behind the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was also about oil in a way, also about fossil fuels, right? So where do you think these historical parallels or non-legitimate parallels lead us today? Like, how could we pursue all these energy purchases and all these negotiations in this regard if it's not the Cold War? So, because, like Svitlana, I think you just put it like that. We can judge from this, so to say, where this war is going. So. Like based on these premises, can we say what kind of developments we are going to face in the near future in this regard, with regards to the energy supplies and nuclear energy as well? Do we understand the path like in front of us? What awaits us, or is just a kind of a total fog of war, as you mentioned, Clausewitz put it?
Yes, thanks, Vasil, for that. And you're absolutely right. And I will begin from the beginning of your question about these historical parallels. So obviously, globalization has a long history. And we can see certain interdependencies existing even centuries ago. But it's one thing to depend on silk or salt, and it's totally another thing to depend on every fucking chip or this, or elements to produce paper, or, you know, whatever, right? So there are what we speak about globalism today, right? Globalization today is an extreme codependence. And this scale matters, right? So it matters more than the pattern of codependence that, again, had a long history. So what this total penetration of industries, outsourcing here and there and etc. Every enterprise, every corporation is global, and every tiny detail is produced somewhere else. When interdependence goes this way, then it is a totally different picture. And of course, previous interdependencies or dependencies produced their own confrontations, probably, or wars or whatnot. But what I'm saying now, it's almost my fear is this high interdependency does not open a bright future in this particular situation for us. And because I constantly see what the acts of different governments that may be qualified as betrayals, they all have their connection and links to these particular needs that are shaped by the global capitalism. And that's why, and that's one thing that I want to say. So I don't want to go in details in my pessimistic visions, which I hope will never come true. But I want to at least point to them as some possibility that we need to think how to avoid in a certain way, or at least to voice it, to make it visible to those who could make probably certain decisions, etc. Right? So even there, my pessimism is exaggerated, which I think it is not, but maybe someone would think so. But I want to speak about it in this particular tone that is political for me. Another thing that I want to comment is particularly about this term globalization, which evokes with this global metaphor. It evokes with this smoothness. And of course, I myself just talked about certain smooth organization, but it is also nothing smooth. And just thinking about a very complex assemblage of, let's say, internet and media technologies and etc., just co-edited a book on that matter where we spoke about cyberwar topologies. And topology seems to be a much better term here, which takes us away from this smoothness and agreement, but actually introduces a more convoluted organization, kind of, relations and etc. So in a certain way, you could see in the form of some literally Klein bottle or Mobius strip or some interior aid. And you can think where is Ukraine and how it is at the same time connected, but also separated from everything in some topological pocket or fold, right? So, and with this topology and seeing this war as topological, as very visible, but also very invisible, very connected, but at the same time, when something can be entirely kind of disconnected and enclosed somewhere, it's very important, I think. And so, and that's what I also think is a form of current global capitalism economy is topological. So it has pockets, folds, various speeds, and so on, right? It's nothing smooth. It's nothing in the speed of light. It's actually with this very complex thing. And that's why sometimes it's so difficult for us to kind of even speak about this current war, to narrate, to kind of understand certain relations, because something look like related and not related at the same time, and etc. And we do not know whether should make sense of all dots or what dots actually do not connect and what not, right? So with all this visibility and invisibility, this very complex topological structure of this global capitalism.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. Yeah, we are actually out of time, so thanks a lot again for joining us today. I have a kind of a strong feeling as if we are in between the first part of Terminator 1 and at the beginning of the second edition of the series. Really a very dark but absolutely realistic picture. I would like to hear more about your pessimist vision, Svitlana, but we will leave it here for now. So thank you so much, dear viewers and listeners, for joining us. Tomorrow we will host the final event of this series. So see you tomorrow at the same time. And thanks so much again, Oleksiy and Svitlana. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, everyone.